Security rushed him out, convinced he didn't belong. But the man they humiliated? He wasn't just another guest. Damon Washington, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar hospitality empire, had just bought the very hotel that denied him service. And in minutes, the staff who mocked him would learn the hardest lesson of their lives. This isn't revenge. It's accountability. What happens when power meets prejudice and every choice has consequences? Watch closely, because this is the moment when arrogance meets its match. The Grand View Imperial gleamed under the golden evening sun, its marble floors reflecting chandeliers that could make any guest feel like royalty. But tonight, something, or rather, someone, was about to challenge everything this luxury establishment believed about power and privilege. Damon Washington approached the reception desk, his steps deliberate, calm, unassuming. A black man in worn jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a leather jacket, he looked like any other traveler. But that first impression would be a lie. Damon was the 34-year-old CEO of Washington Hospitality Group, a multi-billion-dollar empire built from nothing, and tonight he was undercover. His newest acquisition, a chain of luxury hotels, included the Grand View Imperial. This visit wasn't about comfort, it was about justice. Victoria Sterling, the hotel's 45-year-old manager, barely glanced at her computer before her eyes narrowed at him. She had been managing this location for 12 years, and she prided herself on one thing above all else: maintaining exclusivity. In her world, that meant judging who belonged and who didn't. "Excuse me, sir," Victoria said, her voice sweet but sharp, the kind of politeness that dripped disdain. "This is a private establishment. Perhaps you've made a mistake." Other guests, elderly couples, young tech professionals, society wives, looked up, sensing the performance that was about to unfold. Their whispers filled the lobby like a soft storm. Damon remained calm. He smiled slightly, a subtle signal of confidence, and replied evenly, "Good evening. I have a reservation under Washington Hospitality Group." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at the screen. "I highly doubt that," she said, signaling security with a flick of her hand. Two guards moved forward, tall and imposing, their crisp uniforms a visual barrier between Damon and the rest of the lobby. "You see," Victoria began, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "we maintain certain standards here." Her voice carried authority, judgment, and the assumption that she was protecting an elite space from someone unworthy. Damon simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the performance without buying into it. He had been here before, in boardrooms, restaurants, and country clubs, places where prejudice disguised as policy tried to define him. But this hotel was now his world, and he was about to see its flaws firsthand. He pulled out his phone, calmly asking her to check the system. "The reservation should be there," he said, politeness perfect, controlled. Victoria's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Sir, I don't need to check anything. I can see with my own eyes that you don't belong here." The lobby grew silent, a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Staff members exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they should intervene. The guests, however, nodded along, some even smiling in approval at what they assumed was proper enforcement. Damon's presence alone was a provocation, challenging every assumption they had about wealth, status, and skin color. Victoria emphasized her point. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Holiday Inn down the street." Damon remained composed, extracting a black American Express Centurion card from his wallet. Invitation only, unlimited spending. Victoria barely looked at it, dismissing it as a potential fake. Anyone could print cards, she thought. She didn't yet know the magnitude of her mistake. Security flanked him, ready to remove him, but Damon's calmness betrayed experience. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm a guest here." Jake Morrison, the lead security officer, hesitated. He had worked hotels long enough to recognize real trouble, and this wasn't it. But orders, we're orders. Victoria's voice rose. "He's trespassing. Remove him immediately. As Damon was escorted toward the revolving doors, he observed everything. The expressions of guests, the discomfort of staff, the smug satisfaction on Victoria's face. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered comment was being logged in his mind. This wasn't just an incident. It was a case study in prejudice, arrogance, and the weaponization of privilege. Outside, Damon made a call that would change everything. His rideshare had been deliberate, his casual attire chosen to test the staff. In minutes, the reality of his presence would disrupt the illusion of control Victoria believed she had. But for now, he let the humiliation unfold. Each step, each echoing footfall across the marble was deliberate, a demonstration of patience, restraint, and strategy. This was the setup. The lobby was a theater, Victoria Sterling its unwitting star. And Damon Washington? He was the observer, the player, and the master of consequences waiting just beyond the curtain. By the end of tonight, everything would change. Not because of anger or revenge, but because power, when combined with dignity and justice, has a way of exposing truth. The guests would remember, the staff would remember, and the man they humiliated. He would ensure the world remembered what happens when arrogance meets accountability. Damon stood in the lobby, the soft hum of conversation all around him, a silent storm gathering at his feet. The Grand View Imperial's golden chandeliers reflected an image of opulence, but tonight they were witnesses to something darker. Prejudice in action, flaunted with authority and rewarded with approval. Victoria Sterling had no idea that the man she scorned was not only her guest but her new owner, a fact that would soon upend her entire worldview. Victoria's eyes narrowed as Damon maintained calm, unflinching. "Sir, this is a private establishment," she repeated, her voice saccharine yet razor-sharp. "We maintain standards, certain standards. I'm sure you understand." Other guests whispered among themselves, leaning in as if the unfolding scene were entertainment rather than cruelty. A woman in pearls tilted her head, her gaze both appraising and approving. A young tech entrepreneur smirked, sipping his cocktail as if he were witnessing a lesson in social hierarchy. Damon's posture didn't change. He made no sudden moves, gave no sign of irritation. Calmness, after all, is disarming. "Ma'am," Damon said quietly, his tone deliberate, each word measured. "I have a reservation under Washington Hospitality Group. Please check your system." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "I highly doubt that," she said, dismissing his presence like a bad joke. She gestured toward the two uniformed security officers who had flanked her earlier. "Remove him. Now." Jake Morrison, the lead security officer, hesitated. Something about Damon's poise told him this was not a standard trespassing situation. He had seen aggressive guests. He had seen fraud attempts. But this calm, collected man radiated control rather than threat. Yet Victoria's voice rose, again cutting through any doubt. "He is disrupting our guests. Remove him." The officers stepped forward. Damon raised his hands slowly, palms visible, every gesture deliberate. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm a guest here." As they escorted him toward the revolving doors, Damon's eyes swept the lobby, memorizing every expression. Every guest, every staff member, every whisper, every approving nod. It all mattered. These were the actors in a small but telling theater of privilege. And tonight, they were all witnesses. Outside, Damon made a call. Calmly, silently, his instructions set wheels into motion that would ripple far beyond this lobby. He had prepared for this moment meticulously, not for revenge but for accountability. Returning inside, he observed Victoria Sterling in her element. She had constructed a stage, the lobby, the guests, the approving audience. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was a performance designed to assert control, to affirm the social hierarchy she so faithfully protected. But Damon now held the script and the power to rewrite the story. "Ma'am," Damon said, stepping back toward the reception desk, "I believe we need to clarify a few things." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. She raised an eyebrow. Clarify what, sir? My identity, my reservation, and the rights of every guest in this establishment. Damon's tone was calm, but carried an authority that made Victoria instinctively recoil. He pulled out his business card, black, understated, engraved. Victoria glanced at it dismissively. Anyone can print a card, she said with a hint of mockery. Of course, Damon replied, his voice soft, measured. But you might want to check the reservation again, for accuracy. Ryan Chen, Victoria's assistant manager, looked nervous. He had seen enough of these dynamics to know that her actions were unjust, but he was trapped between loyalty and morality. His fingers trembled over the keyboard as he hesitated to speak up. Sir, maybe we should just, Ryan began. Did I stutter? Victoria snapped, cutting him off. Her voice carried authority, but beneath the surface there was unease. Damon's demeanor unnerved her, but she refused to admit it. The lobby was silent now, the murmurs replaced by tense anticipation. Guests sensed a change, though they could not name it. Damon was no ordinary guest. He was composed, in command, and entirely unaffected by their judgment. Victoria's theatrical insistence escalated. We have a dress code, standards. You clearly don't belong here. Perhaps another hotel would be more suitable for someone of your style. Damon's eyes didn't waver. He exhaled slowly. Ma'am, I am Damon Washington. My company made this reservation 3 days ago. Could you please verify it? Her eyes narrowed. Something clicked. A recognition, perhaps a memory. But she suppressed it. Impossible. I don't know what game you're playing, but impersonating guests is illegal, she said, signaling Ryan to call security. Damon raised a finger gently, subtly, controlling the space without aggression. Ma'am, you've just insulted the owner of this property. But that isn't the point tonight. The point is observing your behavior and its consequences. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some were embarrassed, some were intrigued. A young black couple, immaculately dressed, exchanged knowing glances. They had experienced this before, elsewhere, and recognized the silent, oppressive patterns of selective service and systemic bias. Victoria's smirk faltered. She did not yet know the depth of her error. Damon continued, his voice calm, measured, deliberate. This hotel represents more than luxury. It reflects values, culture, and systems of power. When you act as judge and jury over who belongs, based on skin color or appearance, you enforce an injustice that extends far beyond tonight. Jake Morrison, the security officer, felt his training clash with morality. His instincts had been right all along. Damon was no ordinary guest. The calm authority, the patience, the poise, it was all intentional. But Victoria's command was absolute. He hesitated. Victoria, sensing hesitation in her staff, raised her voice. I don't need to check anything. I can see he doesn't belong here. Damon nodded slowly. Exactly. And that, ma'am, is the behavior we will document. He pulled out his phone, opening a call to his assistant, Sarah. Within seconds, the plan he had been preparing for months went live. Corporate channels were alerted, legal teams activated, and the acquisition announcement was poised to go public. The reality of his presence, his identity, and the consequences of Victoria's actions were about to unfold in real time. The young black couple watched, astonished. Their own experiences of exclusion and humiliation were being validated. Staff, members exchanged glances, realizing that the rules they had followed blindly might now lead to reckoning. Victoria, sensing the walls closing in, attempted to regain control. This is outrageous. You cannot do this. This is entrapment. Damon's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't entrapment. This is observation and accountability. Tonight, the world sees what happens when power is wielded without conscience. Nor. Chen finally found his voice. Sir, the reservation is legitimate. Penthouse suite, confirmed. Victoria's face turned pale. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of revelation. Damon's calm, calculated composure had drawn the truth. out like water through cracks in stone. Guests began pulling out phones, some recording, some checking news alerts. Social media notifications began flooding into Damon's device. The acquisition of the hotel chain, which had been carefully orchestrated through intermediaries, was now public knowledge. Victoria's humiliation, the same performance she had orchestrated, was about to become her permanent undoing. Damon took a step closer, addressing Victoria directly. "You wanted to make a statement about who belongs in luxury hospitality. Congratulations. You've succeeded beyond your imagination. But remember, actions have consequences." Her smirk vanished entirely. Panic replaced it, and the veneer of authority cracked. Staff members began texting, reporting, and preparing statements. Guests murmured. The lobby, once a theater of discrimination, had become a courtroom of moral reckoning. He gestured to the cameras and the gathered audience. "Every word, every action, every decision you made tonight is now documented, and the world is watching." Victoria's attempts to speak faltered. The words she had wielded as instruments of control now sounded hollow, meaningless. Damon's calm, collected presence had not only exposed her prejudice but also shifted the balance of power irrevocably. The lobby, once her stage, was now a chamber of truth. And Damon Washington, in casual clothes with the patience and authority of a seasoned strategist, held the gavel. The lobby had transformed into a charged arena. Guests whispered nervously, phones lifted, capturing every word. Staff moved cautiously, uncertain of their role in this sudden upheaval. Victoria Sterling, once the embodiment of authority, now stood exposed, her carefully constructed image cracking under the weight of reality. Damon stepped forward, every movement deliberate, radiating calm control. He surveyed the room, noting the fear, curiosity, and quiet approval in the eyes of those around him. This was no longer just about a reservation. It was about accountability, visibility, and power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damon began, his voice steady and commanding, "thank you for your patience tonight. You've all witnessed behavior that is unfortunately all too common in high-end hospitality." He allowed a pause for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Discrimination is not subtle. It is costly. Tonight you saw it in action, and now we are addressing it." Victoria's cheeks flushed, her lips tightening into a forced smile. "This is absurd," she spat, attempting to regain control. "You have no right." "On the contrary," Damon interrupted softly, holding up a hand. "I have every right. I am the majority stakeholder of this property as of today. Every action you take within these walls, every policy you enforce, every guest you judge, now falls under my review. And tonight, you've shown exactly how you wield that power." The words landed like stones in a pond, rippling through the crowd. Gasps escaped some guests while others whispered behind gloved hands, recognizing the subtle but unmistakable pattern of abuse Victoria had enacted for years. Ryan Chen's fingers trembled as he clutched his tablet. He had been caught between loyalty and integrity, and now, both collided in real time. He looked at Damon, silently acknowledging the truth. Victoria, sensing the tide turning, attempted a counterattack. "You can't. This is manipulation. This is entrapment." Damon shook his head slightly, his expression unyielding. "Entrapment requires deception and malice. This," he said, gesturing to her, to the witnesses, to the lobby, "is transparency. Every word, every gesture, recorded and observed. The world is watching, and your actions will have consequences." At that moment, the first notifications began pinging on guest phones. News alerts flooded in. Washington Hospitality Group acquires Grandview Imperial. New CEO takes control after racism expose. The headlines were live, unalterable, and damning. Victoria's attempt at control evaporated before her eyes. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of shock, vindication, and disbelief. The staff, emboldened by the public exposure, began speaking up, recounting moments of bias and selective enforcement they had witnessed over the years. Their words were careful but firm, forming a mosaic of evidence too compelling to ignore. Victoria's composure broke. She pointed a trembling finger at Damon. How could you? This is humiliating." Damon's gaze remained steady. "Humiliation is a byproduct of accountability," he replied. "Tonight, you had a choice. Act with fairness or perpetuate discrimination. You chose the latter." Security officers shifted uneasily, some lowering their heads, realizing that loyalty to prejudice was no longer defensible. Guests began recording live streams, their social media networks amplifying the moment in real time. The lobby was no longer a private space. It was a stage for justice. Victoria's voice grew desperate. "You can't do this. I built this hotel. I manage this team. I have connections." Damon nodded slowly. "Connections do not erase misconduct. Influence does not justify injustice. Tonight's systems are shifting. You will answer for your actions, professionally and publicly." A soft chime sounded from Damon's device. He glanced at it, acknowledging the subtle orchestration that had been months in the making. The corporate board had been notified, legal counsel engaged, and an official investigation into discriminatory practices initiated. Victoria's personal and professional reputation was now fully entangled in the consequences of her behavior. Guests exchanged glances, some in silent approval, others in awe at the precision of Damon's execution. The young couple who had been observing in the background nodded subtly, seeing validation in their own lived experiences. The power dynamic that had long oppressed them was finally being challenged. Victoria's attempts to interject became frantic. She accused, she pleaded, she begged for control, but every word seemed to tighten the noose of accountability. Damon's calm, deliberate demeanor only amplified her unraveling. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Victoria could hear. "You had the power to change tonight. You could have treated everyone fairly. You didn't, and now the consequences are yours alone." Her eyes darted around, searching for allies, but none were forthcoming. Staff members avoided eye contact, guests looked on, and the media, now live, recorded every moment. Victoria's kingdom of influence was crumbling, and Damon was the architect of its collapse. As he returned to the center of the lobby, Damon addressed the assembled crowd. "Let tonight serve as a reminder that privilege is temporary, and power without conscience is unsustainable. The systems we tolerate, the biases we ignore, these define the culture of any institution, and accountability, though uncomfortable, is essential." The room remained silent, heavy with the gravity of the moment. Victoria, her face pale, finally slumped into a nearby chair, defeated. Her authority, her facade of control, had been dismantled. With patience, strategy, and unwavering calm, Damon paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Cameras continued to roll, guests continued to watch, and the world outside the lobby had begun to witness a reckoning. The story was no longer about a single reservation or a single act of prejudice. It was about the larger systemic issues of power, control, and injustice. And in that lobby, amidst the whispers, the murmurs, the subtle nods of understanding, Damon Washington stood unshaken, a symbol that intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity could triumph over entitlement, arrogance, and prejudice. The climax reached its peak as Victoria, humiliated and exposed, realized the truth. The world had changed tonight, and she was on the losing side. Damon's careful orchestration, months in preparation, had succeeded without a single act of violence, proof that power, when wielded with precision and patience, can create undeniable justice. The intensity, the drama, and the emotional stakes had reached their zenith. Every witness, every staff member, every guest, and every viewer online had now seen the consequences of unchecked bias. The climax was complete, and the story was poised to move toward resolution, with systems realigned and lessons indelibly learned. The lobby, once alive with tension, now hummed with a quieter, more reflective energy. Guests lingered, some in whispers, others in thoughtful silence, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. Victoria Sterling, still seated and shaken, was no longer the commanding presence she had once been. Her empire of influence, carefully constructed over decades, had been disrupted in a single night, not by anger, not by brute force, but by strategy, patience, and accountability. Damon Washington moved through the room methodically, checking on staff, acknowledging guests, and ensuring that the transition from chaos to resolution was seamless. His calm presence served as a stabilizing force, reminding everyone that justice need not be loud or destructive. It could be deliberate, precise, and effective. For the staff, the evening had been transformative. Those who had previously felt powerless now realized that their voices mattered. Maria, a floor manager who had quietly endured years of bias, approached Damon with tears in her eyes. "I've never felt seen before," she admitted, her voice trembling. Tonight feels like change is actually possible." Damon nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "Change begins with acknowledgement," he said softly, "and your courage is what will sustain it." Outside the hotel, news outlets began circulating footage and accounts of the confrontation. Social media platforms erupted with discussions about fairness, privilege, and accountability in luxury hospitality. Industry professionals debated the implications, while viewers around the world shared their own stories of discrimination and inequity. The narrative had grown beyond a single lobby or a single act. It had become a symbol of systemic change, a tangible example of how one person's resolve could spark awareness and action. Victoria, meanwhile, was escorted to a private conference room. Her initial panic had given way to a grudging understanding. The world had changed, and she could no longer rely on intimidation or reputation to maintain control. She faced formal reprimands, an internal investigation, and the public scrutiny she had long evaded. For the first time, she understood that privilege without accountability was not immunity. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and there was no path back to the authority she once wielded so freely. Damon observed her from a distance, noting the subtle shifts in her demeanor. She was angry, yes, but there was also recognition, a spark that perhaps with reflection she might learn something valuable. Damon did not gloat. Justice, he knew, was not about revenge. It was about creating conditions where fairness, integrity, and accountability could thrive. The lobby slowly returned to normal operations, but the atmosphere remained charged with awareness. Staff members spoke with more confidence. Guests treated one another with more empathy. And the culture of the hotel began its slow transformation. Policies were reviewed, training programs implemented, and communication channels opened to ensure that bias, subtle or overt, would be addressed proactively. Damon's influence extended beyond the immediate environment. His strategic approach became a case study for corporate leaders, ethics boards, and organizational consultants. The evening's events were analyzed not for scandal, but for insight, how planning, calm observation, and ethical leverage could dismantle entrenched systems of prejudice without violence or spectacle. It was a lesson in power exercised responsibly, a demonstration that patience and precision often outweigh raw emotion or aggression. For the guests who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, the experience became a defining memory. The young couple who had observed quietly from the back spoke of newfound awareness. "We never realized how subtle discrimination could be until tonight," one of them admitted. "Seeing it challenged so publicly, it made us think differently about how we treat people in our own lives." The ripple effect was subtle but profound. Small changes in perception, behavior, and expectation, multiplying outward with time. In the days that followed, Victoria attempted to regain footing. She issued public statements that were cautiously contrite, tried to repair relationships, and sought advice from mentors. But the lessons had been burned into the collective consciousness of the staff, guests, and broader public. Words alone could not erase the impact of her actions, nor the accountability that had been established. Meanwhile, Damon continued his work quietly, observing, mentoring, and guiding change in both visible and subtle ways. He understood that A single event, no matter how dramatic, was only part of a larger movement toward justice. Transformation required vigilance, patience, and ongoing commitment. The hotel lobby was just the beginning. The principles demonstrated that night could and should be applied wherever power imbalances persisted. The true impact became evident over time. Employee retention improved, guest satisfaction increased, and the hotel gained a reputation not merely for luxury, but for integrity. Staff felt empowered to speak up, guests felt respected, and subtle discrimination became more difficult to ignore. The narrative shifted from scandal to learning, from humiliation to systemic improvement. On a personal level, Damon reflected on the experience with quiet satisfaction. He knew that real change was measured not by headlines or viral moments, but by the sustained shift in behavior, culture, and consciousness. He had orchestrated an outcome that balanced justice with humanity, and the result spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Victoria, now facing the consequences of her actions, slowly began to comprehend the larger lesson. Authority without empathy is fragile. Influence without integrity is transient, and power unchecked by accountability inevitably collapses. She had lost her position, yes, but she had also gained, perhaps reluctantly, a deeper understanding of responsibility, a seed of reflection that might one day prevent future transgressions. The lobby, once a stage for tension and conflict, had become a space for reflection, growth, and change. Every guest, staff member, and observer carried the lessons forward: the importance of standing against injustice, the power of deliberate strategy, and the enduring value of moral clarity. And in the end, the story left a lasting impression. That courage, patience, and careful orchestration could challenge entrenched privilege. That witnessing and addressing injustice could create real systemic change. And that accountability, when applied thoughtfully, could transform individuals, organizations, and communities alike. The narrative closed not with vengeance, but with impact. The lesson was clear, resonant, and universal. Systems are only as strong as the integrity of those who operate within them, and meaningful change often begins with a single act of deliberate courage. Damon Washington had demonstrated that power, intelligence, and morality, when aligned, could reshape reality, not through chaos but through intentional, strategic action. The resolution was complete, leaving viewers with a sense of justice, closure, and the inspiration to consider how they too might act when faced with inequity.